Welcome to Exploration Dreamland, a quiet read-aloud of the writings of explorers of the real world and the worlds of imagination. Drop anchor, relax into your comfortable bunk, and drift off to Dreamland with us as we read an abridged version of Wild Nature Won by Kindness by Elizabeth Brightwen, 8th edition, published in 1898. If you would like to stay in touch between episodes, you can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Exploration Dreamland. If you would like to recommend a text, please email us at explorationdreamland, all one word, at gmail.com. Before we begin, a small content note and a warning. Please be aware that the early sections of this book include occasional descriptions of pet deaths, some by misadventure or accident. If you prefer to avoid those, please rejoin us at episode 13. This book was written quite some time ago, and therefore does not necessarily reflect current-day outlooks, language choices, and husbandry practices. The scientific texts may use outdated terminology or be inaccurate in light of more recent discoveries. This podcast was created primarily to help you relax and to entertain you. The texts are chosen for their ability to charm and interest you rather than for educational purposes. Now, take a deep breath in, and as you exhale, relax any tension in your muscles. Close your eyes, snuggle into your sleeping space, and listen to tonight's tale. Wild Nature Won by Kindness by Elizabeth Brightwen. To Sir James Paget, Baronet, Fellow of the Royal Society, Doctor of Civil Law, etc., etc. My dear Sir James, the little papers which are here reprinted would scarcely have been written but for the encouragement of your sympathy and the stimulus of what you have contributed to the loving study of nature. Shall you then think me presumptuous if I venture to dedicate to the friend what I could never dream of presenting to the professor, and if I ask you to pardon the poorness of the gift in consideration of the sincerity with which it is given? Pray believe me to be yours very sincerely, Eliza Brightwen, The Grove, Great Stanmore, June 1898. Preface to the 5th edition. 2 short chapters, one describing the life of an antlion and the other the habits of a tame toad, were added to the 2nd edition, which was in other respects a reproduction of the first. Introduction. I have often wished I could convey to others a little of the happiness I have enjoyed all through my life in the study of natural history. During 20 years of variable health, the companionship of the animal world has been my constant solace and delight. To keep my own memory fresh in the first instance, and afterwards with a distinct intention of repeating my single experiences to others, I have kept notes of whatever has seemed to me worthy of record in the life of my pets. Some of these papers have already appeared in The Animal World. The majority are now printed for the first time. In the following chapters, I shall try to have quiet talks with my readers and tell them in a simple way about the many pleasant friendships I have had with animals, birds, and insects. I use the word friendships advisedly, because truly to know and enjoy the society of a pet creature, you must make it feel that you are, or wish to be, its friend, one to whom it can always look for food, shelter, and solace. It must be at ease and at home with you before its instincts and curious ways will be shown. Sometimes, when friends have wished me to see their so-called pet, some scared animal or poor fluttering bird has been brought for whom my deepest sympathy has been excited, and yet there may have been perhaps the kindest desire to make the creature happy, food provided in abundance, and a pleasant home, but these alone will not avail. For lack of the quiet, gentle treatment which is so requisite, the poor little captive will possibly be miserable, pining for liberty, hating its prison, dreading the visits of its jailer, and so harassed in its terror that in some cases the poor little heart is broken, and in a few hours death is the result. In the following simple sketches of animal, bird, and insect life, I have tried to show how confidence must be gained, and the little wild heart won by quiet and unvarying kindness, and also by the endeavor to imitate as much as possible the natural surroundings of its own life before its capture. I must confess it requires a large fund of patience to tame any wild creature, and it is rarely possible to succeed unless one's efforts begin in its very early days, before it has known the sweets of liberty. In many cases, I have kept a wild animal or bird for a few days to learn something of its ways, possibly to make a drawing of its attitudes or plumage, and then let it go, else nearly all my pets, except imported creatures, have been reared from infancy, an invalid's life and wakefulness making early morning feeding of young fledglings less difficult than it would have been in many cases, and often have painful hours been made bearable and pleasant by the interest arising from careful observation of the habits and ways of some new pet animal or bird. I have always strongly maintained that the love of animated nature should be fostered far more than it usually is, and especially in the minds of the young, and that, in fact, we lose an immense amount of enjoyment by passing through life as so many do, without a spark of interest in the marvelous world of nature, that book whose pages are ever lying open before us. The beauties of the country might as well have been left uncreated for all the interest that thousands take in them. Not only town dwellers, who might be excused for their ignorance, but those who live in the midst of fields and woods often know so little about the curious creatures in fur and feathers that exist around them that they are surprised when told the simplest facts about these their near neighbors. One reason may be that it is now so much the fashion to spend the year in various places, and those always moving about have neither the time nor opportunity to cultivate the little undergrowths of quiet pleasures which spring out of a settled home in the country, with its well-tended garden and farmyard, greenhouses, stable, and fields, the horses and cattle petted and kindly cared for from their birth, dogs and poultry, and all kinds of special favorites. There is a healthy, happy tone about such a life, and where it exists and is rightly maintained, good influence is, or ought to be, felt in and around the home. Almost all children have a natural love of living creatures, and if they are told interesting facts about them, they soon become ardent naturalists. I well remember that in my childhood I had a great dread of toads and frogs, and a relative to whom I owe much for having directed my mind into the love of animated nature, took up a frog in her hand and made me look at the beautiful gold circle round its eyes, its curious webbed feet, its leaping power arising from the long hind legs. She told me also of its wonderful tongue, so long and flexible that it folded back in its mouth, and that the frog would sit at the edge of an ant-hill and, throwing out the tongue with its sticky point, would pick off the ants one by one as they came out. When I learnt all this, I began to watch such a curious reptile. My fears vanished, and like Kingsley's little daughter, who had been wisely led to care for all living things, and came running to show her father a dear delightful worm she had found, so I too have been led all through my life to regard every created thing, great or small, attractive or otherwise, as an object well worth the most reverent study. Perhaps I ought to explain that I have described methods of taming, feeding, and housing one's pets with extreme minuteness in order to help those of my readers who may be very fond of live creatures, and yet from lack of opportunity may have gained no knowledge of their mode of life, and what is required to keep them happily in health and vigor. I have had to learn by experience that attention to very small details is the road to success in keeping pets as well as in other things, and the desire to pass on that experience must be my excuse to more scientific readers for seeming triviality. Many admirable books have been written by those well qualified to impart their knowledge in every branch of natural history, and the more such books are read, the better. But the following pages simply contain the life histories of my pets and what I personally have observed about them. I shall be glad indeed if they supply any useful information or lead others to the more careful study of the common everyday things around them, with a view to more kindness being shown to all living creatures, and tender consideration for them. I trust I may feel that this little book will then have attained its purpose. Quote, gem, flower, and fish, the bird, the brute, of every kind occult or known, each exquisitely formed to suit its humble lot, and that alone. Through ocean, earth, and air fulfill unconsciously their Maker's will. End quote. From a poem by James Montgomery. Rearing birds from the nest. The most delightful of all pets are the birds one has taken the pains to rear from the nest. They never miss the freedom of outdoor life. They hardly know what fear is. They become devotedly attached to the one who feeds and educates them, and all their winsome ways seem developed by the love and care which is given to them. I strongly deprecate a whole nest being taken. One would not willingly give the happy little parent birds the distress of finding an empty home. After all their trouble in building, laying, sitting, and hatching, surely they deserve the reward of bringing up their little babes. Too often, when boys thus take a nest, they simply let the young birds starve to death from ignorance as to their proper food, and not rising early enough to feed them. It is a different matter if, out of a family of 6, one takes 2 to bring up by hand. The labor of the old birds is lightened, and 4 fledglings will sufficiently reward their toil. The birds should be taken before they are really feathered, just when the young quills begin to show, as at that stage they will not notice the change in their diet and manner of feeding. They need to be carefully protected from cold, kept at first in a covered basket in flannel, and if the weather is cold, they should be near a fire, as they miss the warmth of the mother bird, especially at night. I confess it involves a good deal of trouble to undertake the care of these helpless little creatures. They should be fed every half hour, from 4 in the morning until late in the evening, and that for many weeks until they are able to feed themselves. The kind of food varies according to the bird we desire to bring up, and it requires care to make sure that it is not too dry or too moist, and that it has not become sour, or it will soon prove fatal, for young birds have not the sense of older ones. They take blindly whatever is given them. Dick the Starling. Few people would think a cat could possibly be a tender nurse to young birds, but such was really the case with a very interesting bird I possessed some years ago. A young starling was brought up from the nest by the kind care of our cook and the cat. Both were equally sympathetic and pitied the little unfledged creature who was by some accident left motherless in his early youth. Cook used to get up at some unheard-of hour in the morning to feed her clamorous pet, and then would bring him down with her at breakfast time and consign him to Kitty's care. She, receiving him with a gentle purr of delight, would let him nestle into her soft fur for warmth. As Dick became feathered, he was allowed the run of the house and garden, and used to spend an hour or so on the lawn, digging his beak into the turf, seeking for worms and grubs, and when tired he would fly in at the open window and career about until he could perch on my shoulder or go in search of his 2 foster mothers in the kitchen. His education was carried on with such success that he could soon speak a few words very clearly. Strangers used to be rather startled by a weird-looking bird flying in from the garden and saying, "Beauty dear, puss puss, meow." But it was still more strange to see Dick sitting on the cat's back and addressing his endearments to her in the above words. Kitty would allow him to investigate her fur with exemplary patience, only objecting to his inquisitive beak being applied to her eyelids to prise them open when she was enjoying her afternoon nap. Dick's love of water led him to bathe in most inconvenient places. One morning, when I returned to the dining room after a few minutes' absence, I found him taking headers into a glass filter and scattering the contents on the sideboard. After dinner, too, he would dive into the finger glasses with the same intention, and when hindered in that design, would visit the dessert dishes in succession, stopping with an emphatic "Beauty dear" at the sight of some coveted dainty, to which he would forthwith help himself liberally. In summer, Dick had to resist considerable temptation from wild birds of his own kind, who evidently made matrimonial overtures to him. But though he camped out for a few nights now and then, he never seemed to find a mate to his mind, and elected to remain a bachelor and enjoy our society instead of that of his own kith and kin. Dick was certainly a pattern of industrious activity, never still for 2 minutes. He seemed haunted by the idea that caterpillars and grubs existed all over the house, and his search for them was carried on under all possible circumstances. Every plait of one's dress, every buttonhole would be inquired into by his prying little beak, in case some choice morsel might chance to be lurking there. Dick lived for a few happy years, and then his bathing propensities most unhappily led to his untimely death. One severely cold day in winter he was missed and searched for everywhere, and after some hours his poor little body was found stiff and cold in a water tank in the stable yard, where the ice had been broken. He had as usual plunged in for a bath, and we can only suppose the intense cold had caused an attack of cramp, so that he could not get out again, and thus drowned. Many tears were shed for the loss of the cheery little bird, who seemed like a bright, ubiquitous sunbeam about the house, and our only consolation was the thought that, as far as we knew, he had never had a sorrow in his life, and we can only hope that if there are happy hunting grounds for birds, our Dick may be there, bright and happy still. Richard II. On a wet, stormy day in May, a young unfledged bird was blown out of its nest and was picked up in a paved yard where somehow it had fallen unhurt. There he was found by my kind-hearted butler, who appeared with the little shivering thing in his hand to see if I would adopt it. The butler pleaded for it, and it squawked its own petition piteously enough, but I was far from strong, and I knew at what very early hours these young feathered people required to be fed. I therefore felt I ought hardly to give up the time which sometimes brought me the precious boon of sleep after a wakeful night. Very reluctantly I refused the gift, and felt wretchedly hard-hearted in doing so. I will confide to my readers that in my secret heart I thought the poor orphan was a blackbird or thrush, and they are birds I feel ought never to be caged. They pine and look so sadly longing for liberty. Even their song has a minor key of plaintiveness when it comes through prison bars, and this feeling helped my decision. A few days after, I heard that the birdie was adopted in the pantry and was being fed in the intervals of business. When a few days later I was definitely informed that the birdie waif was a starling, then I confess I did begin to long for another little friend such as my former Dick had been, and it ended in my receiving Richard II, as we called him for distinction, into my own care and keeping, and month after month I was his much-enduring mother. Most fledglings are much the same at first. Whenever I came in sight, the gaping beak was ever ready for food, and the capacity for receiving it was wonderful. Richard grew very fast. Little quills appeared and opened out into feathers. His walking powers increased till he could make a tottering run upon the carpet. And then he began to object to his basket, and would have a perch like a grown-up bird, practised going to sleep on one leg, which for a long time was a downright failure and ended in constant tumbles. He was always out of his cage whilst I was dressing, and was full of fun and play, scheming to get his bath before I did, and running off with anything he could carry. When he was about 2 months old, I had to go to Buxton for a month's visit, and decided that I could not leave Richard behind, as he needed constant feeding with little pieces of raw meat, and was just old enough to miss my training and care. He was therefore to make his first start as a traveller, in a small cage, papered round the sides, the top being left open for light and air. He was wonderfully brave and good, very observant of everything, and if scared, a word from me would reassure him, until at last even an express train dashing past did not make him start. It was very amusing to see the attention bestowed upon him at the various stations where we had to get out. A little crowd would gather round and stare at such a self-possessed small bird. I was asked if it was a very rare bird. It seemed almost absurd to have to reply, "No, only a common starling." But people are so accustomed to see a caged pet flutter in terror at its unusual surroundings that my kingly Richard rather puzzled his admirers. When we began life in our apartments, one important consideration in the day's proceedings was the starling's food. There was no home larder to fall back upon, so a daily portion of tender rump steak had to be obtained, to the great amusement of the butcher with whom we dealt for our own joints. About this time the plain grey plumage began to be varied by 2 patches of brilliant little purple feathers, tipped with greyish-white, which appeared on each side of his breast. Some began to peep out of his back and head. He moulted his tail and had rich dark feathers all over in time, till he arrived at being what he was often called, a perfect beauty, glossy and brilliant, bronze gold and purple, with reflet of rich green and little specks of greyish-white all over his breast. This richness of colour, combined with his beautiful sleek shape, made Richard a very attractive bird. When we returned from Buxton, I was so confident of the bird's tameness I used to carry him in my hand out to the tulip tree, and there I often sat and read, while Richard would pry into the moss and the bark of the tree, searching for insects, and though he could fly well by this time, he did not try to do so, but seemed content to keep near me. One morning I heard his first articulate word, "Beauty," spoken so clearly it quite startled me. I had been diligently teaching him by constant repetition for many weeks, and by degrees he gained the power of speaking one word after another, till at last he was able to say, "Little Beauty," "Howdy do," "Pretty pretty," "Beauty dear," "Puss puss," "Meow," and imitated kissing exactly. All this was intermingled with his native whistle and sundry inarticulate sounds, intended, I suppose, to result in words and sentences some day. Whilst talking and singing, his head was held very upright, and his wings flapped incessantly against his sides, after the manner of the wild birds. My bird's talking powers were remarkable, but they were the result of his intelligence being drawn out and cultivated by constant loving care, attention to his little wants, and being talked to and played with and made into a little feathered friend of the family. Now must be told an episode which cost me no little heartache. Richard was out in my room one morning as usual, when the room door happening to be open, away he flew into the next room, and out at an open window into the garden. I saw him alight on a tree, but by the time I could reach the garden he had gone. I saw a group of starlings in a beech tree near by, and another set were chattering on the house roof, but there was no telling if my Richard was one of them. I called till I was tired, and continued to do so at intervals all day, but no wanderer appeared. His cage had been put on the lawn, but to no purpose. I feared I should never see my pet again, because I supposed he might be lured by the wild birds till he got out of hearing of any familiar voice. I confess it was hard to think of my bright young birdie starving under some hedge, for I felt sure he was too much of a gentleman from his artificial bringing up to be able to earn his own living. All I could do was to resolve to be up very early next day and call again and again on the chance of his being within hearing. Before 6 o'clock next morning I was seeking the truant. Plenty of wild birds were about, the bright sun glancing on their sleek coats, all looking so like my pet it was impossible to distinguish him. I little knew that he was then starving and miserable under a bush in the upper part of the garden. I continued calling and seeking him until breakfast time, and fast losing all hope of ever seeing him again. About 11 o'clock I was returning from the kitchen garden, with my hands full of fruit and flowers, when, to my intense delight, poor little Richard came slowly out from under a laurel and stood in the path before me, as veritable a type of a birdish prodigal son as could well be imagined. His feathers were ruffled, his wings drooping. His whole aspect irresistibly reminded one of the jackdaw of Rheims, and the way he sidled up to me, with half-closed eyes and drooping head, was one of the most pathetic things I have ever experienced. He so plainly said, "I'm very sorry, hope you'll forgive me, won't do it again," and certainly his mute appeal was not in vain, for down went my fruit and flowers, and with loving words I took up my lost darling and cooed over him all sorts of affectionate rubbish until we reached home and he was restored to his cage. There his one desire was water. Poor fellow, he was nearly famished. I think another hour would have seen his end. There is no water in the garden except in the stone vase in front of the dining-room window, and he would not have known how to find that, so he must have been 28 hours without drinking anything beyond a possible drop of dew now and then. I had to feed him with great care, a little food, very often, until he recovered a measure of strength. He was very drooping all day, and I quite feared he might not live after all, he was so nearly starved to death. After some days, however, Richard was himself again, and as bright and amusing as ever. I have not related the amusing characteristics of his daily tub. His love of water was a perfect passion, and water he would have. At first he was treated to a large glass dish on the matting in the dining-room, but he sent up such a perfect fountain of spray over curtains, couch, and chairs that the housemaid voted that bird a nuisance, and a better plan was devised. In the conservatory is a pool of water, with rockwork and ferns at the back, and there is a central tube where a fountain can be turned on. I made a small island of green moss a little above the water, and, placing Richard upon it, I turned the fountain on to play a delicate shower of spray over him. He was perfectly enchanted, and fluttered, turned about, and frisked like a bird possessed. As he became accustomed to it, I began to throw handfuls of water over him, and that he did enjoy. He would cower down and lie with his wings expanded and beak open, receiving charge after charge of water till quite out of breath. Then he would run a few paces away on his island till he recovered himself, and then would go back and place himself ready for a renewed shower. I never saw such a plucky bird. If I had been trying to drown him, I could not have done more, for sometimes he was knocked backwards into the pool. But no matter, he was up again and all ready in a minute. He generally tired me out, and when I turned off the fountain, he would either fly or run after me into the drawing-room and go into his cage, which always stood there, and there followed a very careful toilette. a general oiling and pluming and fluttering until his bonny little feathers were all in good order, and then would follow endless chatter, and he would inform the world that he was a little beauty, pretty little dear, etc. Starlings seem to have an abundant supply of natural oil in the gland where it is stored, for his feathers were never really much wetted by his tremendous baths, and he was a slippery fellow to hold, his plumage was so glossy and sleek. A word must be said about his temper. It was decidedly not meek by any means, and his will was strong, so the least thing would bring a shower of pecks in token of disapproval, and if scolded, his attitude was most absurd. He would draw himself up to a wonderful height, set up his crest feathers, and stand ready to meet all comers, like a little fighting cock. And when a finger was pointed at him, he would scold and peck and flap with his wings with the utmost fury. And yet, if a kind word was said, all his wrath vanished, and he would come on your hand and prise your fingers apart, looking for grubs as usual. It seemed strange that his habit of thus searching for insects everywhere should continue, though he was never by any chance rewarded by finding one. A starling's range of ideas may be summed up in the word grubs. It was always immensely amusing to strangers to see Richard, when out in the room, searching with his inquisitive beak in the most hopeless places, with a cheerful, happy activity, as if he always felt sure that long-looked-for grub, for which he had searched all the years of his life, must be close by, round the corners somewhere, under the pen-wiper, behind that book, amongst these coloured silks, and if interfered with he would give a peck and a chirp, as much as to say, "Do let me alone, I'm busy. I've got my living to get, and grubs seem scarce." Richard was the only bird I have ever had who learnt the nature of windows. He never flew against them. He had 1 or 2 severe concussions, and being a very sensible bird, he concluded he wouldn't do it again. He would fly backwards and forwards in the drawing-room in swift flight, but I never feared either the windows or the fire, as he avoided both. Several times Master Richard was found flying about in the drawing-room, and yet no one had let him out. We could only suppose that by some mischance the door must have been left open, yet we all felt morally certain it had been fastened properly, and there was much puzzlement about the matter. However, the mystery was soon solved by my watching Richard's proceedings. I heard a prolonged hammering, and found he was at work upon the hasp of his cage door. He managed to raise it up higher and higher, till by a well-directed peck he sent it clear out of the loop of wire which held it in its place. Still the door was shut, and it required a good many pecks to force it open, but he succeeded in time, and out he flew, delighted to find himself entirely master of the situation. Then I watched with much amusement his deliberate survey of the room. I was ill at the time, and he first flew to greet me and talk a little. He hopped upon my hand, and holding firmly on my forefinger, he went through his usual morning toilette. First an application to his oil gland, then he touched up all his plumage, drew out his wing and tail feathers, fluttered himself into shape, and when quite in order, he began to examine the contents of my breakfast tray, took a little sugar, looked to see if there were any grubs under the tray cloth, peered into the cream jug, decided that he didn't like the salt, gave me 2 or 3 hard pecks to express his profound affection, and then went off on a voyage of discovery autour de ma chambre. He squeezed himself between every ornament on the mantelpiece, flew to the drawers, and found there some grapes which were very much to his taste, so he was busy for some time helping himself. He visited every piece of furniture, threw down all the little items that he could lift, and, as I was reading, I did not particularly notice what he was about until he came on a small table near my bed, and then I heard a suspicious noise, and turned to find the indefatigable bird with his beak in my ink bottle, and the sheet already plentifully bespattered with black splashes and little streams of ink trickling over the table cover. Such misplaced zeal was not to be borne, so Richard had to be caged. When he was 7 months old, his beak began to turn from black to yellow. The color began to show first at the base of the beak, and it went on gradually until in a month's time it was nearly all yellow, though it was black at the tip for some time longer. As time went on, Richard's talking powers increased. He quite upset any grave conversation that might be going on. His voice dropped at times to a sort of stage whisper, as if he wished to convey some profound secrets. "Oh, you little beauty, pretty little dear, howdy-do," used to mingle most absurdly with the conversation of his elders and betters. When he could not have his bath in the conservatory, I used still to give him his glass dish, which we used together, for he would never enjoy his ablutions without me, and I became considerably sprinkled in the process. His delight was to have a water fight, pecking at my fingers, scolding as if in a great rage, using his claws, and all the while calling me dear little Dickie, beauty, pretty little dear, etc., for he had no harder words to scold with. Certainly the effect was most comical. When he supposed he had gained the victory, he would settle down to a regular bath, fluttering and taking headers until he was dripping wet and delightfully happy, and the next thing would be to perch on one's chair and shake a regular shower of drops over one's books or work. Richard was not, as a rule, at all frightened by noises or by being carried about in his cage in strange places. But early one morning, when he was out in my room, he flew away from the window with a piercing scream of terror and hid himself quite in the dark, behind my pillow, shivering with fright, as if he felt his last hour had come. We found out, when this had occurred several times, that his bête noire was a great heron, which used occasionally to leave the lake and circle round the house, high up in the air. It could only have been by pure instinct that Richard was inspired with such terror whenever he saw the great winged bird. And it showed that artificial training, though it develops additional powers and habits, in no way interferes with natural instinct. The starling has a remarkably active brain. Its quickness of movement, swift flight, and never-tiring activity all show the working of its inner mind, but more than that, it seems to be capable of something akin to reasoning. Richard sometimes dropped a piece of meat on his sanded floor, and I have often seen him take it up and well rinse it in his water till the sand was cleansed away, and then he would swallow it. And a dry piece of meat he would moisten in the same way. Now this involved a good deal of mental intuition, and I often wondered whether he found out that water would remove the sand by accident or by a process of thought. In either case, it showed cleverness and adaptability. So also with the processes of opening the door of his cage. He had first to prise up the latch with his beak to a certain height, and then by sudden sharp pecks send it clear of the hasp, then descend to the floor, and by straight pecks send the door open. If he could not get the door to open thus, he understood at once that the latch was not clear of the hasp, so he went back to his perch and pecked at it until he saw it fall down, and then he knew all was right. When the second summer of Richard's life came round, some young starlings were obtained, as we much wished to rear a hen as a mate for Richard in the following year. These birds were placed in a cage in the same room with him, as we hoped he would prove their tutor and save us the trouble of teaching them. But no, Richard evidently felt profoundly jealous of these intruders, and day after day remained perfectly dumb and out of temper. This went on for a week, and then, fearing he might lose his talking powers, I was obliged to remove them and pay special attention to him, to soothe his ruffled feelings. He did not begin to talk until more than a week had passed by, evidently resolving to mark in this way his extreme displeasure at others being admitted to share our friendship, a curious instance of innate jealousy in a bird's mind. For more than 5 years, Richard was a source of constant pleasure and amusement, and was so much a part of my home life that when anything unusual happened, in the way of a garden party or a change in daily events from any cause, one's first thought was to provide for his comfort being undisturbed. I confess I dreaded the thought of his growing old, and could not bear to look on to the time when I must learn to do without his sweet, cheering little voice and pleasant companionship. Alas, that time has come, and I must now tell how the little life was quenched. In a room to which he had access, there was a small aquarium half full of water, thickly covered with pondweed. I had left Richard to have his usual bath whilst I went down to breakfast, and when I returned I could nowhere find my pet. His usual bath was unused. I called and searched, and at last in the adjoining room I saw the little motionless body floating in the aquarium. The temptation had been too strong. Richard thought to have a lovely bath, had flown down into the water. No doubt his claws were hopelessly entangled in the weed, and thus, as was the case with my former starling Dick, the intense love of bathing led to a fatal end. The sorrow one feels for the loss of a pet so interwoven with one's life is very real. Many may smile at it and call it weakness, but true lovers of animals and birds will know what a blank is felt, and how intensely I shall ever regret the untimely fate of my much-loved little Richard. Stay tuned for the next segment from Wild Nature Won by Kindness by Elizabeth Brightwen. Please follow, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast app. Keep in touch with us on Twitter and Instagram, and recommend us to anyone you know who could use a quiet break or a little help falling asleep. Exploration Dreamland is produced, edited, and hosted by me, Sarah Van Zaley. A big thank you to Project Gutenberg for helping me find this and many other interesting publications. Thanks also to Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com for providing the theme music for this show. The title of this piece is Kalimba Relaxation Music, if you would like to visit his website to hear it in its entirety. Sweet dreams.